United States has actually accepted international discipline. It's actually changed its policies in response to some international agreement or some international tribunal, like as it has in the case of the WTO.
Sure.
And since the US is the most powerful country in the world, that does say something about the success of the regime. But I do think that there were many elements in the WTO that signaled overreach, which subsequently became more and more of a problem. I think it was the beginning of this process of increasingly reaching behind the borders and into domestic regulations and standards in a way that would create problems down the line.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you describe in the book is sort of the reversal of globalization to a certain extent. And you look at the numbers, that's a fact. If you look at trade as a share of world output, peak trade was 2007. And with the Great Recession, there was clearly a collapse in aggregate demand, particularly import demand from the United States, Europe, and Japan. But there was not a recovery, okay? And in fact, a lot of restrictive trade measures were put in place in that period of time. We're still not back to that level of trade as a share of output that we were at in 2007. Now that's sobering to my mind, but there's another piece to this, which is in this same period of time, we have, I think, at least in the United States, completed the weaponization of trade politics, okay? And to be honest, I see this as a bipartisan achievement, okay? Both parties worked on it really hard and delivered it perfectly, but that's where we are now. We have this weaponized set of politics. If we're gonna move forward, how do you think we ought to deal with that? What can we do to kind of step back from the cliff?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, with respect to the relative decline of trade globally, I think actually much of that has very little to do with the actual protectionist policies per se. I think much of that has to do with the fact that that there is an ongoing process of moving away from goods towards services. Goods are going to be much more tradable than services are. There is a process of deindustrialization that's going on around the world. Again, there's a process of automation and digitization that means that a lot of manufacturers, advanced countries are regaining comparative advantage in manufacturers which they had actually lost to lower income countries with lower labor costs. So there's a reshoring process that's going on. And of course, probably quantitatively the most significant might be China's adjustment from a kind of a very export-oriented, sort of quasi-mercantilist model towards much more of a domestic sourcing of its industrial structure, and I think that's not to say that protectionism is not going to have a big quantitative impact on trade, but I think so far actually we have not seen its and the effects are more subtle in terms of creating uncertainty about cross-border trade and investment. But the question you raise about where we go is I view that we are at a juncture where for the longest time we worried that the problem with the world economy was that it wasn't sufficiently open, and therefore what we needed to do was to sort of progressively knock down those barriers to trade, and we started out with the quantitative restrictions and then tariffs, and then we were incredibly successful at that. And I think, right now, I don't think the main problem facing the world economy is that it's not sufficiently open. The main problem is that it doesn't have sufficient political buy-in, that it has lost legitimacy, and that what we need to do is to endow the trade regime, the world economy, with greater legitimacy, convince people that this is not just an elite's playground, that this is not just corporations and multinationals and financial interests and pharmaceutical companies who are writing the rules, who are benefiting from it, that it generates broad benefits. So I think, in my ideal world, when trade negotiators come together, whether it's just big mega deals, regional or bilateral agreements, or the WTO, what they're really focusing on is what is it that we can do to increase the legitimacy of the system, as opposed to what is it that we can do to basically keep on engaging in this, exchange of market access kind of a mindset, which, as I said, I think achieved a lot in the early decades after the Second World War, but I think the gains have become relatively small. That game has become increasingly redistributional, and it perceived as such. And I think what we need to do is think about, okay, how can we make this process much more legitimate, increase credibility and trust in it? That's going to entail engaging much more newer actors in it, and changing the negotiating agenda from in a lot of ways in which it has been crafted to this day, paying a lot more attention to what NGOs, civil society organizations, labor groups, consumer groups want. A little bit less attention to what sort of the traditional agenda setters in trade negotiations have been.
Yes, one of the ironies for me in the last, say, 15 years in the United States is no matter how bitter and difficult the politics of trade have been, one of the things that hasn't changed are the U.S. terms of trade with the world. I mean, once you phase in NAFTA and the Uruguay round commitments, which all happened practically by about 2004, we haven't really done anything to change our tariff regime in a meaningful way. We had a free trade agreement with a number of countries who already had duty-free access to the United States. So there wasn't much change, and yet all this tension and difficulty.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think the TPP, for example, is a good example.
Right.
I think if you ask most economists, without a particular axe to grind, TPP wasn't going to be a big deal for the United States.
Right.
And I think that a lot of the appeal of the TPP in this town was that, for foreign policy, geopolitical kind of reasons in terms of setting, being the linchpin of a kind of a Pacific strategy for the United States, clearly focusing on sort of, keeping China on the wayside for the time being, setting the rules, and then that China could join on American terms rather than sort of being much more. All of that. I'm not a foreign policy expert, and maybe this was good, maybe this was bad, but the fact is that you also had to sell this as what it was, which was sort of a trade agreement, and when you looked at who it was really going to benefit in the end. Maybe pharmaceutical companies didn't get everything they wanted, but they shaped largely the agenda of what it is that was being negotiated. Financial institutions, investors with the various sort of the ISDS, investor tribunals, got a lot of what they were. So it was, it looks more or less like there are special interests. This was more like a special interest-driven trade deal that doesn't amount to, huge amount of overall gains for the U.S. economy. And as you say, then you get all the political trouble that goes with it, and and needlessly, you tar and delegitimize the trade regime and trade agreements with this. And I think that's the main cost.
That's a very good point. One of the very interesting comment in your book is about the locus of anti-globalism in the political sphere, and you make the point that is absolutely true, and I'd never even thought of before, is that the anti-global sentiment tends to be on the right wing of the politics in both Europe and the United States, but it is on the left side in Latin America, sort of rejection of the Washington Consensus. What does that mean for where the American left or maybe the European left goes now? What happens next?
Well, first of all, it's a big indicator of the failings of the American left and in large part of the European left as well. So that's an interesting story. But before I get to that, it's important to note that populism isn't necessarily just a right-wing nativist movement. And I think, you can going back to U.S. history, of course, the first first self-consciously populist movement in history was the US populists, who were very much, in today's term, was really a left-wing.
Correct.
At the tail end of the 19th century, when they railed against the gold standard and the bankers and the financiers in New York City. That sort of looks like,
Sure, William Jennings Bryan would have fit right in with today's sort of Republican politics.
Exactly.
And he
well, yes, but except that it was much more directed in today's term. It looks more like Syriza and Podemos and looks like Latin American left-wing populists, because it didn't have that kind of the nativist edge to it, or the ethno-nationalistic edge that we associate with right-wing populism that dominates in Europe today. So I think that is a number of different reasons. And as you say, in Latin America, it's been mostly left-wing because the target there was the Washington Consensus, the IMF, the US, multinational companies. So there, that the discontent associated with the economic reforms of the late 80s and 1990s, could be, you could build a narrative around that sort of targeted these financial institutions or multinational corporations in many ways that the European exceptions today, whether it's Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece, are railing against very much the same thing, except that in that case, it's not the IMF, it's the Troika or the institutions. But they have been also the victims of their versions of financial globalization in very much the same way that Latin America had. Now, the right-wing populism, I think, comes around because I think immigration provides a politically very salient and easily manipulable cleavage in societies on which right-wing populists thrive. So they have if the left-wing populists divide society between us and them, who is the people? So always the question with populists is, who are the people? When you define the people, there has to be a non-people. There has to be the other. And for the left-wing populists, the other are the financial elite, the cosmopolitans, or the foreign corporations, and for the right wing populists, it's the immigrants, it's the Muslims, and or it's the Jews, it's the Gypsies, it's the Roma. And I think the presence, the salience of immigration as a recent issue, I think, has provided fuel to right-wing populists in terms of providing a kind of a narrative for that explains to ordinary people sort of where their troubles are coming from and who is the culprit. And so I think that's one side of it. But the other side, going back to the question sort of you intimated, is where is the left? Why haven't the left been taking advantage of it? Now, in 2 decades ago, I wrote a little monograph called Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And then, at the time, I thought that the main beneficiary of this potential backlash would be the left, because they're the natural sort of group to take advantage of these issues with respect to people who feel left behind, people whose incomes are stagnating, people who feel that the elites aren't responding to. And I think in large part the reason for that is that the mainstream left of center parties, whether it's in the United States or in Europe. So in the United States, it was the main sort of Democratic Party, and in the Europe, it was the Socialists and the Social Democrats.
Correct.
In the 1990s and beyond, they really became very much cheerleaders of very much the same kind of globalization, to which now we have the response. So you have the phenomenon of the Clinton Democrats and Bill Blair's New Labor, and the French socialists, who were actually the biggest promoters of financial globalization the world has ever seen, oddly enough. So they became essentially associated with this. And we saw this in the 2016 election in the United States, where there was no way that Hillary Clinton could credibly distinguish herself as somebody who would actually respond to these problems, because she was too closely associated with that wing of the party. And I think this is part of the reason that I think where sort of the left has been missing in action, I think.
Fascinating. Now, at the end of the book, you have a very provocative chapter about sort of a new Bretton Woods, a new way to sort of create a multilateral understanding of how to go forward, which I very much appreciated reading it. Here's the question it left me with, is while globalization has real popularity problems in the United States and Europe, sort of the developed world, it is awesomely popular in about half the world not here. If you go to East Asia, you've experienced globalization, and it's been awesomely good for you and your family, and probably looked at on a macro basis, the best anti-poverty program in world history for the past 30 years, just looking at what happened in Asia. So how do you put together an agreement that bridges that gap? The rejection or the backlash in the developed world, and the fact that globalization has been awfully good in the rest.
Well, it is true that developing countries, in particular China, has been a huge beneficiary of the globalization of, let's call it the globalization of other countries' policies, because as you know, of course, China has pursued a very mixed strategy with respect to globalization. It has been very discriminatory in terms of those aspects of globalization it likes, and those aspects it doesn't, and it's been very zealous at guarding its own autonomy with respect to the management of capital flows, management of its exchange rate, its requirements on foreign corporations in terms of technology transfer, joint ventures, in terms of what they can do. So I once had a Chinese student who explained to me China's strategy with globalization as being like you open a window, but you also place a screen on it. So that you get all the fresh air that you want, but you can keep the mosquitoes out. And so
I know who the mosquitoes are in that particular
well, I won't go into who the mosquitoes are. But the point is that it's been a very strategic kind of globalization, and that kind of globalization works for pretty much everybody. So the question is to make it all fit together. And I think to make it all fit together, I think there'll have to be an understanding that if China and other countries want to do their own thing, play to their own drummer in globalization, that other countries will also need to have the kind of policy space for themselves to do whatever they want. So I think ultimately everybody has an interest in a thriving and relatively open world economy. But we need a new kind of a set of traffic rules that understand that there are legitimate reasons why countries may want to have certain degree of autonomy with respect to their trade and industrial and social and regulatory and intellectual property right policies. And that's what I meant earlier when I was referring to a system that's trying to enhance the legitimacies by saying that we need to devise those traffic rules where countries feel relatively free to uphold their own policies and regulatory approaches without imposing too many burdens on other countries. And we have a lot of experience in doing that in the specifics of trade. We haven't thought through too much when we extend into other areas, whether it's social policies or regulations or intellectual property or industrial policies. But I think that's the direction in which we need to go.
So we've got a very durable principle in trade called least trade restrictive. You can regulate, but do so in a least trade restrictive manner. Is that something that you think can be extended?
I don't find the least trade restrictive very useful. And I think it's because it privileges, because there are a lot of constraints, administrative, human resources, second best political constraints that governments have to take into account when they're devising their policies. To impose the requirement of least trade restrictive puts one of those requirements at the very top. Sort of makes it a kind of lexicographic kind of ordering. And I think that's that's not always the right way to think about policy, that sometimes it might be cheaper administratively or might make fewer demands on your human capital to do things that are trade restrictive, but you're getting your health objective achieved, for example, some other ways. So I don't find that particularly useful. But it is clear that if you are negotiating trade agreements, then you have to ensure that people are going to live by it. Right. And then the question becomes, what are those principles? And where it is absolutely critical to have strong disciplines, and where it is less important to have those strong disciplines. I think the strongest disciplines are required where countries have very strong incentives to engage in beggar thy neighbor policies.
Yes.
But in a lot of areas, countries pursue policies that are not necessarily beggar thy neighbor, but if anything, they're beggar thy own consumer or beggar thy own taxpayer policies. And for good or bad, this is what their political systems produce. And I don't think the international trade negotiators or the international regime is necessarily very good at discriminating between those domestic policies like agricultural policies or policies with respect to GMO or beef hormones, where countries are good or bad at sort of having appropriate kinds of regulations for themselves. And I think those are areas where we've probably edged too much in terms of privileging trade rules, privileging market access requirements, and I think have bought ourselves more political tension and negative reaction against the trade regime than it was really worth.
Fair enough. Early in the book, I think maybe the second or third chapter, you talk about Europe and the struggles that Europe is going through. And you make other points in that chapter, one of which I liked the most was the idea that structural reform is really overrated, which you're welcome to go into. But you make the point in the Europe chapter about the weakening of the nation state. And now there's debate about whether that was a feature or a bug with regard to the European Union. But could you talk a little bit about what you see as Europe's future and how do they find their way out of the current struggles?
Yeah. I mean, Europe is caught in this highly unstable intermediate position where it's pushed very far in economic unification, economic integration, and its political integration lags very far behind. And this is a very, the only time we've ever had that was when countries were run by colonial powers. And in the presence of democracy, it's very difficult to have such an imbalance between economic integration and political integration. And so I think ultimately going forward, the European Union will have to decide either if it wants to really have a greater political integration to match its degree of economic integration, or it will have to scale back its economic integration to bring it back in line into what is effectively a nation-state system within Europe. Now, I think when you look back and ask the question, how did Europe get into this mess? I think there were sort of two kind of trains of thought. One was, the view of many conservative economists, which was that the markets were self-stabilizing to begin with, and then problems with markets were with the government, and therefore you needed to move away from this sort of Keynesian understanding that the government needs to provide all the supports for markets, and therefore the fact that you were integrating economically while sovereignty still remained at the nation-state level, and therefore, but the states couldn't do anything because all the markets and the rules were Europe-wide. That was good because you were forcing governments to get away from the working of the market. And that was sort of the conservative economic thinking about that. There was a more sort of practical policymaker view, which was that, yes, we realize that we're getting things, the economic integration is getting out of sync with political integration, but we'll manage. The way to build a political community is through this old functionalist line of thinking that dominated European economic integration from day one, which is that we first get the economics and then the political community comes, the institutions come afterwards. Yeah. Maybe that would have worked if you had given the European Union a few more decades, but then the global financial crisis struck and they got caught in this. But the fact that neither of those two kinds of views, neither the view of the conservative economists, which basically said, well, governments don't have much role to begin with, nor the view of these policymakers that eventually we will build greater political integration and a quasi-political federation in Europe. Neither of those could have been said in public, because neither of those would have been very popular, would have had much political buy-in. And I think that sort of tells us, with hindsight, the problems that the Europeans took on themselves. But I still think that this is a choice that Europeans have not confronted. It's only the European populists, actually, who explicitly make their choice. And they say explicitly that this is a trade-off, and we make our choice in favor of the nation state. And that's why we're in favor of loosening the economic links within the European Union, because that's the only way we can regain full economic sovereignty. But most of the centrist political forces in Europe, unfortunately, are dithering. So they keep saying that you can simultaneously have a single market and sort of nation state and democracy at the same time. And I've argued, and I argue in this book, that you cannot. You can have at most two out of those three things, not all three.
So is Brussels and the Commission, and in the sense of a group of ambitious and not particularly accountable regulators, are they cause or cure or something else in all this?
Well, I think at this point they're cause, because I think the European governance has become way too technocratic. As political scientists, like to say in Europe, all policy is in Brussels, all politics is at the national level. So that's, so that disjuncture is the source of the problem. So if all your, your regulations are being determined in Brussels, but the only political space in which you can contest them is really
in the
still at in the national capital. That's unsustainable. And I think that there's a sense in which the response to that over technocratization of politics, of policies in Europe, is at the source of this backlash against Brussels. And so the only way you can solve this problem is either you bring policy back to the nation states, or you bring much more politics to Brussels or Strasbourg, and unfortunately neither of those paths, is either palatable or economically very easy to do.
Right. If Shakespeare were to have written a subtitle for your book, it would probably be "Let's Kill All the Economists."
No.
No, but I did note, out of curiosity, that you did blame the economists, and thinking about that, it's like, they're not a particularly sympathetic group. If you're going to pick a target, economists is probably a pretty good one. But why don't you talk about what economists have done wrong, but also what you'd like to see them do?
No. I mean, I'm an economist. I'm a proud economist, and I love my discipline. So I think economists have ended up acting as sort of cheerleaders for a version of globalization, this hyper-globalization, which I think was deeply problematic. And I think sort of one of the questions that I scrutinize in the book is why is it that, let me back up here, many of the problems that we encounter today in the world economy and in the reactions to hyper-globalization are things that we would have been able to foretell by what economics teaches us in the first place. In some sense, it's a repeat of economic history. We've seen, sort of an earlier version of hyperglobalization be reversed after the gold standard. So if you know a little bit of economic history, you should have known that this isn't necessarily all just one way. And then everything we teach in international monetary economics or international trade theory is about the frequency of financial crises that come with globalization, or the redistributive consequences of too much opening up to trade. All of that we should have known. So the puzzle is, an economist should have known better than most, because that's what we teach. And so the puzzle here is why, instead of speaking truth to power, economists ended up being sort of essentially either in fact or in appearance cheerleaders for a particular brand of hyperglobalization. And the short answer to that, I think, is that I think economists suffer from this syndrome that I call the barbarians are only on one side of the issue. That is that they have this view that it's really the only barbarians are the protectionists, the people who would want to close up the economy. And I think the fact is that there are a lot of, let's not call them barbarians, but self-interested promoters of particular kinds of globalization on the other side of the issue as well. And I think that we didn't pay sufficient attention that the agenda of globalization might also be captured by self-interested groups, on the other side of the issue, and therefore end up getting an unbalanced or skewed pattern of globalization as a result.
Before we turn to the audience questions, just one more from my standpoint, which is, as you look at the future, what's the alignment and where do you see leadership coming from? I would note that I give you full marks for pointing out that the BRICS is nothing more than an acronym made up by Goldman Sachs to push some research reports, and that these 5-6 countries now have almost nothing in common in terms of their interests in an economic system. So looking for leadership there might not be the right thing to do. But we have a circumstance where, and I've noticed it when I talk to people at the WTO or involved in international organizations, that for 70 years the United States has sort of been the captain of the football team, and now has decided not to show up for practice. No one seems to know what to do. And so can you give us your advice on at least how we think about a step forward?
I think where we need, the leadership most right now is actually national leadership. I think that it's most of the problems of our global economy, and there are areas like climate change or health pandemics where the issues are really truly global, can only be solved by global cooperation. But when you think about the problems of the global economy, whether it's the threat of protectionism or too much agricultural subsidies, or whether it is macroeconomic policies that are too not growth promoting, or whether it's financial policies that do not prevent financial crises. These problems, the sources of their failure are primarily national. They are primarily failures of national governance. So I look for sort of countries where countries are able to solve their own domestic economic and social problems first and foremost. And if they do, then I think that's when we get the best kind of globalization, which I think is the lesson of the Bretton Woods period in some sense, was that we got an explosion in globalization where countries were in fact mostly looking inwards rather than looking towards international agreements or global governance. And there, unfortunately, the news isn't very happy. I mean, we have, I think we're, in the United States, we're going through a deep, I think, political crisis. Britain is in many ways similar, although not so bad. Surprisingly, some parts of the world, which in the past used to be our political and economic basket cases, are doing much better. So Latin America, for example, is in some ways a democratic haven, and doing rather well. And that matters because Latin America is also the part of the world which has the richest history of populism.
Yes.
So the lesson I think is that we survive these things, and things then people and people learn, and it's possible to erect better economic and politics on top of those sort of misguided populist policies. So. So that's what I hope the future will hold for us.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. Well, let's turn to your questions. There's some microphones in the back of the room. If you would, please, three simple rules. First, wait for the microphone. Since we have an online audience, they won't hear your question. Second, state your name and organization, your affiliation, if you would. And then third, please make sure your question is in the form of a question. Thank you. Yes, sir. Right here.
Thank you very much. Peter Allgaier from Nauset Global, formerly with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. So you made the very valid point that the proponents of trade liberalization and freer trade and free trade agreements have lost legitimacy in the minds of the public, at least in the United States. And I think a big part of that is that the metrics used both by the proponents and by the opponents have been, what do these agreements do about our trade deficit? What do these agreements do about increasing jobs? And I think people thinking primarily in very traditional terms about jobs. Yeah. So, and the frustrating thing to me is that trade agreements really play a very minor role in both of those metrics. So my question to you is, if we are to regain legitimacy in the minds of the public, what would be the proper metrics to use in judging whether trade agreements and trade liberalization are in our interests?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think again, most economists would tell you rightly that those aren't the appropriate metrics at all. That neither the trade deficit nor the overall level of employment are strongly or predictably influenced by our trade policies or by our trade agreements, and those should not be the criteria by which we judge whether we have a good agreement or not. I think the appropriate criterion is the standard criterion from Econ 101 or standard trade policies, standard trade theory, which is, does it increase the overall standard of living of most of our citizens. And that's going to come because of our ability to specialize in the things that we're doing better and getting out of things that we're not doing that well in. And that's sort of the standard gains from trade, standard comparative advantage. It's greater efficiency in quite the same way that better technologies improve the efficiency and the functioning of the economy, while at the same time potentially dislocating or hurting some people who might be adversely affected by new technologies because they're stuck using the older technology. But I think the key is to first of all, to make the case that this is not about jobs. And unfortunately, it's an argument that both the opponents and the proponents of trade deals tend to be forced into making arguments in terms of jobs, whereas the real economic argument about trade is never that it affects the level of jobs, that it affects the structure of jobs, it affects the kind of jobs that we have, and not the overall level. I think that's I think what we need to be able to do much better job as economists, telling the public that that's really what the issue is, but also at not poo-pooing and minimizing the dislocations and the losses that might be created as a result. I think one of the big problems with the United States always has been that the compensation and the safety nets have been very weak. Ask yourself the question, why is it that there are a lot of things about the world economy that is contested in Europe, but trade per se is not? I mean, the kind of issue that we have in this country with trade with Mexico, trade with China, the way that NAFTA has become a political hot potato in the United States, there's nothing comparable in Europe. That's because European countries, by and large, have adjusted to trade by having very high levels of social protection. Their welfare states, their social insurance programs are very good and extensive and taking advantage traditionally of taking care of those who are the losers. In the United States, rather than having very high levels of social insurance and social protection, we've had this highly ineffective trade adjustment assistance that are attached to every trade agreement deal that we sign. And for very good political reasons, they never work, because once you sign the agreement, then you have never any incentive to actually put money into these programs after the fact, because there's no incentive. And therefore, sort of we lose credibility because everybody that we promised that they were not going to be losers, that they were going to be taken care of, there are some devastated communities that are still left after the fact. So I think honesty is and humility are two of the key things. Honesty, being clear about what trade agreement really does. It's really about expanding the size of the pie overall and ensuring that that is distributed well, ensuring that the right domestic policies are there so that people aren't left behind, and also humility. Let's not exaggerate how much these deals can actually do. and let's put them into their proper perspective. And I think that's the only way I can think that by being sort of more honest and more humble about these trade agreements, that would be sort of how we can build greater credibility. The other thing, the major thing, however, I would say is changing what the trade agreements are about. We sometimes talk about globalization and trade agreements as if they were, they come in one form. In fact, the form is decided by, who's at the bargaining table, who's lobbying. So, we could be instead of turning trade agreements into agreements about intellectual property rights or financial liberalization or capital flow measures. We could have trade agreements be about, preventing tax competition, right? That would privilege and benefit many different kinds of groups in society. It could be much more about, about labor rights. It could be about, transparency in the way that we regulate and our environmental policies. So there's all kinds of different types of possible agendas for these agreements. And so we should, be aware that the way that, what we negotiate about is also a very critical element of how we're going to, regain legitimacy with these trade agreements.
TAA is even more perverse than you suggest. It's designed to stay small, so the jurisdiction stays in the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. It's that twisted. So
there you go.
We have 4 questions right up here, and so I'll try to take them, and then we'll get to this side of the room. But yes, sir in the front, and then all 3 people in the next row each had a question. So we'll work it.
Jean-François Wattin with CPII, economic think tank in Paris. Didn't have the time to read the book, but read your piece, I think, in the New York Times of NAFTA and TPP. And I was somewhat surprised by what you said on TPP and in relationship to what you just said, because irrespective of the rhetoric and the propaganda and so on, it seemed to me that it was a trade agreement that was going in the right direction as far as preoccupations of a number of progressive, quote-unquote, groups were concerned. So how can we reconcile the views here?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, you're referring to the labor clauses, for example, that the side agreement, not the side agreement, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
I mean, Vietnam specifically, that there was a bilateral agreement between the United States and Vietnam about recognizing free unions, for example. Now, I think that's, I think that was a good thing. Now, my judgment is that, that this was, I put it into the category of TAA-like things. That is that it was in there, but it wasn't going to be effective. I think, that there is still a very basic asymmetry that if you were serious about this, for example, it wouldn't have been my preference. It was serious about this, you would generalize the ISDS to also enable labor and other groups to sue host governments for violation of their labor rights. So you really want to make this, kind of really an equal opportunity kind of a trade agreement, that you're not simply privileging investors and corporations and capital, but you're also trying to raise labor rights. Then I would have said, do something really meaningful, which is to include labor complaints in an ISDS-like procedure. And the difference there, of course, is that it creates incentives, because then you're directly empowering groups as the ISDS empowers investors. You would directly empower labor rights, human rights groups, and NGOs to pursue their case independently, as opposed to in the current agreement, which is the bilateral agreement, which is 5 years, and afterwards you have to decide. And we have the example of previous agreements, as in the Mexican case, as in the case of the Guatemala, where we know that these things aren't followed up by the U.S. government effectively in these trade agreements. So my reading of this was that yes, it sounds very good. But that actually it wouldn't have made much of a difference in practice. So let me just hasten to add that I actually do not think these things are effective in the context of trying to get other countries' labor and environmental policies upgraded through trade agreements. I don't think is a very good approach. So I would do that in other fora. I would pursue different strategies there. The problem of taking these in the context of trade agreements is that it's basically using the trade lever to achieve these ends. And frankly, I would not want US labor unions to be in charge of anything about how labor policy is going to be determined in Malaysia or Vietnam or any of the other countries, any more than I want pharmaceutical companies or US financial institutions determining what intellectual property rights in those countries or what their financial regulations or capital flow measures ought to be. So that's where I am.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hans Kundernani from the German Marshall Fund. I wanted to ask you about migration and how that fits into globalization, because you started out by talking about rebalancing globalization, and clearly barriers to the movement of people have been removed far less than barriers to the movement of capital and goods. And I think you talk in the globalization paradox about how the benefits actually of doing that would be much greater than trade liberalization. But at the same time, even though that aspect of globalization is underdeveloped, as it were, that's where, as you pointed out, the biggest backlash comes, and there's this potential for nativism and so on. And so how do you deal with that? And in particular, how should the centre-left deal with that? Because you seem to suggest, if I understood you correctly, that centre-left parties, the Democrats in the US and Social Democrat parties in Europe, should move to the left on economic policy. But they're also at the same time under pressure to move to the right on migration policy because their voters, particularly working class voters, are very concerned about these issues, and they're losing votes to far right parties often, Front National, UKIP, and so on. So how should the centre-left deal with the migration question?
That's a very, first of all, you're absolutely right that, the unexplored frontier of economic globalization, where the real big gains are, if you want to advance globalization, is in terms of the movement of workers, labor mobility, and that's where the big unexploited gains in globalization are. It's not in any of the agendas that are currently under negotiation. I think the answer to your question of how to do this is it's a question that is unfortunately very unpopular in the left, but that's my answer nevertheless, is that you need to distinguish economic migration from immigration issues. That is to say that it is, do not confuse the temporary circulation of workers. So my ideal program would be a 5-year program of temporary work visas allocated to home countries of temporary workers in terms of bilateral quotas, and with those bilateral quotas replenish according to a formula which takes into account as to how many of these temporary workers the home countries are able to attract back. Very, quick description of what that program would look like. This would have nothing to do with immigration or sort of the political aspect. So I think we need to keep aside sort of the human rights issues, the refugees issues, from the immigration and family unifications kind of issues, which is sort of a political issue, and the economic mobility issue. And I think, unfortunately, it's easy to understand, that in the eyes of many on the left, there is this question about how can you, turn these people, bring them only as economic migrants, and require them, or at least have very strong incentives in the system to make them return back to their home countries. How can you make that compatible with human rights, with the rights of individuals to, have their own families eventually settle where they're working and so forth? But I think this is a trap, because we end up, if we needlessly conflate those issues of immigration, that is getting citizenship rights and political rights, with the question of economic mobility, we end up doing a lot of damage to a lot of people who might have a much better life for themselves, accumulate skills and savings in host economies, and then bring those back when they come back, in turn with others being able to circulate and so forth. So this is, I think, would be a much better, and I think the way to do this would be to be, relatively have a hard line that economic mobility is economic mobility. You're coming to work and to earn skills, but it's temporary. And we understand that we cannot force everybody to go back, but there are essentially, if people from a certain particular nationality aren't coming back, those quotas from their home countries will over time be diminished, reallocated to other countries that will provide a much more welcoming hospital environment to their economic immigrants to come back home again. And then you can have, sort of this competition for workers to come back among developing countries, as opposed to competition for foreign investors, because there would be a carrot at the end. They can send more of your people abroad. So I think, but that does require this sort of disentangling the political immigration issue from the economic one. And we're not there yet, because I think many people on the left in principle do not accept that distinction.
We're running short on time. Since I've neglected this side of the room entirely, we'll take a question here and one over here, and we can wrap up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chen Weihua, China Daily. Yeah, I want to just ask, as a country, not about, just a certain group in the population, do you think, China or US is a beneficiary, victim of globalization? Because the political correct narrative in this country, of course, US is the victim. But there are people argue, Chinese cannot find it hard to digest this, because US multinationals are actually the masters. Use Apple as an example. They have, Chinese only retain less than 10%. People would argue Chinese workers are being exploited. How, US would claim to be a victim. China suffer environmental degradation. That's a big cost. So what's your judgment? Is the US the victim or the beneficiary? Is it fair to say US is the victim? Thank you.
Well, this is a question of, I guess what the evidence points to is that the gains from globalization in the United States have been very unequally distributed. And that in a context where overall economic growth in the last 3 decades has not been extremely high, that has translated into stagnating wages or even falling wages for certain groups of people in the United States. So that's when people say that, United States has not benefited. It's largely about sort of, the median worker. But you're absolutely right. The groups that have been, in terms of the driving seat of setting the rules of globalization, have been the large corporations and investors, mostly based in the United States. And so they have been big beneficiaries. It's just that, so it's really, in the United States, it's been a first-order distributional issue. Now, in China, as you know, inequality has increased very significantly, much more rapidly, in fact, than in the United States as well. But the difference is that China has grown very, very rapidly overall, so that even people at the very bottom have seen their incomes rise very rapidly, even though income inequality has deteriorated. So to some extent, you can say even also in China, the gains from China's economic strategy since the late 70s have been very unevenly distributed. But still, given that, how much poverty has been reduced and how much poor farmers have been able to improve their level of living. So on the whole, everybody seems to have benefited in China. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems ahead. You mentioned environmental stresses. There are, big problems awaiting the Chinese economy still, and there's potentially a big financial crisis that one can't dismiss out of hand. So I think that is the issue. That on the whole, China having grown so rapidly that even people who are at the lower end of the distribution have done very well, whereas in the United States, the median worker, certainly the median male worker, has seen his income stagnate.
Well, this is a fascinating conversation that I don't want to stop, but I need to. I will tell you that behind your seating will be a reception where you can buy a copy of the book. You can speak to Dani. If you didn't get your question answered, you'll have that moment to do it. I highly encourage you to read this book. I read it over the weekend just to prepare for this event, but I'm very glad I did. And I'm very glad, Dani, you made the time to come here to CSIS. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your question.